The real power of humanity. Why we are the most dangerous species. Have you ever thought about what happens when a species is pushed into a corner? When they have no place to run and no hope for escape? What lengths will they go to? Do they give in, or do they dig in their heels and fight back? The question isn't just hypothetical. It holds the key to understanding one of the most dangerous species in the galaxy. And no, it's not the terrifying Vraxian predators or the merciless Hadron warriors. It's something far more unexpected. And that's where the real danger lies. The dimly lit bar buzzed with low conversations and the occasional clink of glasses. But in one shadowy corner, the conversation had taken a turn. The Kazak traders, alien creatures with exoskeletons that shimmered like armor in the weak light, shifted nervously. Their voices dropped to a hush, their eyes darting around the room, as if they were being watched. Even in a place as chaotic and loud as this, the air felt thick with tension, like the weight of something significant was about to be revealed. Gorn, the leader of their group, was a massive reptilian creature, his scales gleaming faintly in the dim atmosphere. He wasn't one to show unease, but tonight, something in the air had shifted. He leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing as he spoke. "I imagine they do what anyone would do," he said, his voice deep and measured. "They either surrender or they fight to the death." The Kazak trader across from him, a sharp-featured insectoid named Sitka, let out a noise that was part laugh, part rasp. It was unsettling to anyone who wasn't familiar with their species, but it wasn't the sound that caught Gorn's attention. It was the way she looked at him, as if she knew something he didn't. "That's where you've missed it entirely." Gorn's tail flicked in irritation. He wasn't used to being questioned. "And what's that?" Sitka's compound eyes glinted, her mandibles clicking in a way that signified thought. She took a long sip from her drink, her insectoid physiology making it look like an odd but deliberate motion. "The humans, Gorn," she said slowly, drawing out the words. "They're not like any other species. They're not just prey. They've learned something that no one else has figured out. Something that can't be beaten by mere strength or numbers." She leaned in slightly, as if sharing a secret. Gorn let out a huff of disbelief, his skepticism almost palpable. Humans, those soft, pink-skinned creatures from that insignificant corner of the galaxy. He shook his head, amused by the suggestion. What could they possibly? Sitka's gaze hardened, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "The Vraxian Imperium learned the hard way." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "Their entire fleet gone. 60 warships just disappeared." Gorn blinked, the words sinking in slowly, as his mind raced to catch up with what he was hearing. "The Vraxians? You must be mistaken. The Vraxians are gone, Gorn," Sitka interrupted, her voice quiet but terrifying. She set her glass down with precision. "Wiped out. Their entire fleet silent. Nothing left but drift pods. No signals, no signs of battle, just silence." Gorn's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing further as the weight of her words crashed over him. "Impossible," he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "The Vraxians feast on species like humans. They would have crushed them." Sitka leaned forward now, her body language shifting from detached to something far more personal. Her eyes, dark and glinting with a quiet intensity, locked onto Gorn's. "The Vraxians thought they could," she said, her voice low and ominous. "But they underestimated the humans. They're not like us. They're not just predators. They have something else. Something that, when used correctly, makes them far more dangerous than anything we've ever encountered." Gorn felt a ripple of unease crawl up his spine. "What do you mean?" he asked, his curiosity growing. though his skepticism remained rooted in his mind. Sitka's mandibles clicked as she pondered her next words carefully, as if deciding just how much to reveal. The humans are problem solvers, Gorn. They don't just overpower their enemies, they outthink them. Every species we've ever encountered, every predator and conqueror, has a single defining trait: strength, speed, weapons. But the humans? They fight with something different. Gorn stared at her, his expression guarded, but the words were starting to form a picture in his mind. The Vraxians, the Hadron, the Cathak, they were all built for war. They had evolved to be apex predators. But humans? What did they have that could possibly match up? Sitka's voice softened, almost wistfully, as she continued. Humans don't need claws, or armor, or sharp teeth. They've learned how to use tools to solve their problems. They've figured out what kills everything else, and they build machines to do it for them. Gorn's eyes widened. You mean they evolve their technology to solve problems, Gorn. Their strength is in their adaptability. They don't need venom. They can synthesize it. They don't need armor. They can forge it. They don't need claws. They've got machines that can do it better. The words echoed in Gorn's mind. The Vraxians, with their relentless predatory instincts, had thought they could conquer Earth, just like every other species they had taken down before. But what they had failed to grasp, what they had completely underestimated, was the simple but profound truth about humanity. They're not like the rest of us. Sitka continued, her voice growing darker, more urgent. They fight with their brains, not their brawn. And they know exactly what they're doing. The weight of this new understanding hung in the air like a storm cloud, and Gorn found himself unable to shake the unease that had settled in his chest. He had always prided himself on his species' strength and strategic minds, but this was something different. The humans didn't just fight, they thought. And that made them far more dangerous than any warrior species he had ever encountered. What happened to the Vraxians? Gorn asked, his voice barely above a whisper, a mix of dread and curiosity. Sitka's mandibles clicked again, the sound harsh in the silence of the room. The Vraxians thought they were superior. They thought they could bully the humans into submission with their fleets, their strength, their weapons. But what they didn't account for was humanity's capacity for survival. Sitka's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dark and knowing crossing her face. The humans didn't just fight back, Gorn. They destroyed the Vraxians' entire fleet. With machines, with drones. They used their own instincts against them. They understood what made the Vraxians tick, how their territorial aggression could be manipulated, and they exploited it. Gorn's mind raced as the pieces began to fit together. The humans hadn't just defeated the Vraxians, they had forced them into a corner, just like the Vraxians had tried to do with Earth. But the difference was, the humans didn't react with desperation. They reacted with cold, calculated precision. They knew what they were doing, Sitka said, her voice steady, almost reverent. And that, Gorn, is what makes them so dangerous. They're not just fighting to survive, they're fighting to win. And when they fight, they don't stop until the problem is solved, one way or another. Gorn sat back in his seat, his tail still as he processed everything Sitka had shared. He had heard stories, rumors, about humanity's strength, about their resilience. But this was something entirely new. A species that had turned weakness into strength. A species that had evolved not to be the strongest, but to be the most resourceful, the most adaptable, the most unpredictable. They don't just fight like predators, Sitka continued, her voice low, almost a whisper. They fight like survivors, and that makes them a force you can't predict, Gorn. You can never know what they'll do next, and that is what makes them so terrifying. Gorn didn't respond immediately. His mind was still spinning, trying to process the depth of what he had just learned. Humanity wasn't like any other species he had encountered. They didn't fight with claws or fangs. They fought with something far more dangerous: their minds. As he sat there, lost in thought, a quiet realization began to settle in. Maybe Sitka was right. Maybe humanity wasn't something to be underestimated. Maybe they were the most dangerous species in the galaxy. And for the first time, Gorn wasn't so sure that the Vraxians' defeat had been a fluke. It wasn't just a matter of strength or weaponry. The Vraxians had made the same mistake that so many other species had before them. They thought the humans were weak. They thought they could crush them. But what they didn't realize was that the humans were capable of something far more dangerous: outsmarting their enemies. Gorn let out a low hiss, the unease in his chest growing. "So, what now?" he asked quietly. "What happens next?" Sitka's mandibles clicked, a sharp sound that echoed through the bar. "What happens next, Gorn, is that you realize you're not facing a predator. You're facing a species that knows how to survive, no matter the odds. And that's something you can't fight with strength alone." For the first time in his life, Gorn felt a deep sense of unease. The galaxy, it seemed, was about to learn just how dangerous humanity could be. The lesson was clear. The humans weren't predators. They didn't need to be. Instead, they had mastered something far more powerful, something that couldn't be crushed by brute force. They had learned to adapt, to solve problems, and to think in ways no one else had ever considered. And in that, they were unstoppable. Have you ever wondered what happens when you corner a species? When they find themselves with nowhere to run, no escape, and no hope left? What do? Do they surrender, accept their fate, or do they dig in their heels and fight back? The question is simple, but the answer is profound. And the beings who face such a situation are sometimes not what we expect. It's not always about raw strength, sheer power, or even battle strategy. No, the real danger can come from something far more subtle, something that can't be defeated by just brute force. The answer to that question, my friend, is what lies at the heart of what makes humanity the most dangerous species in the galaxy. And it's not because of what we are, but because of what we've learned. The Kazakh traders huddled in the corner of the dimly lit bar, their movements twitchy and uneasy. They sat at a round table, their large insectoid eyes darting around the room, as though every whisper of sound and every movement made them nervous. It wasn't fear so much as caution, like they were afraid of being overheard. The air in the bar was thick, humid, and the noise around them felt muffled, as though the entire universe was holding its breath in anticipation. Across from them, Gorn sat calmly. His reptilian scales shimmered in the dim light, his large, powerful frame betraying no hint of anxiety. But even Gorn couldn't ignore the strange tension in the air. Something was different. Something was unfolding in the galaxy. Something that these traders, with their wisdom and connections, had already sensed. He broke the silence, his voice deep, deliberate, and cool as ice. "I imagine they do what any species would do in such a situation," Gorn said, his sharp eyes narrowing. "They either surrender, or they fight to the death." The Kazakh trader, Sitka, opposite him, leaned back slightly, her insectoid mandibles clicking in a strange cadence, almost as if she were amused. "That's where you're wrong, Gorn," she replied, her voice low but intense. "That's where you've completely missed it." Gorn's tail flicked, a sign of growing annoyance. He had never been one to be so casually challenged. He was used to being the one who controlled the room. He raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to explain. "And what's that?" he asked. His voice almost dismissive. Sitka didn't seem fazed by his tone. She reached for her drink, taking a long pull from it, her mandibles clicking softly as she did so. "The humans, Gorn," she said, her voice quiet yet dangerous, like a whisper in the wind. "They're not like any other species in the galaxy. They're not just prey. They're something entirely different. Something we don't understand. And the Vraxians learned that the hard way." Gorn's brow furrowed, skepticism written all over his face. "Humans? Those soft, pink-skinned creatures from that insignificant little corner of the galaxy. What could they possibly—" Sitka cut him off, leaning forward, her compound eyes glowing with an intensity that stopped Gorn mid-sentence. "They're not what you think, Gorn," she said, her voice now almost a growl. "The Vraxian Imperium, with their might and their fleets, they thought they could simply crush the humans, as they had done with so many others before. But they made a critical mistake. They underestimated the human." Gorn blinked, processing the words. "The Vraxians," he repeated, still struggling to wrap his mind around it. "You must be mistaken. The Vraxians, they eat species like humans for breakfast." Sitka's eyes darkened, and she leaned in even closer. "Gone, Gorn," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Their entire fleet, gone. 60 warships, just disappeared. No distress signals, no debris, no survivors. Just silence." The weight of her words hit Gorn like a hammer. He stared at her, his mind reeling. He had known of the Vraxians, an empire built on conquest, their entire culture founded on devouring weaker species. The idea that their mighty fleet had simply vanished was inconceivable. "Impossible," Gorn muttered, shaking his head. "The Vraxians feast on species like humans. They would have crushed them. They could never have been defeated so easily." Sitka's mandibles clicked again, her voice now cold and steady. "The Vraxians thought they could," she said softly, the words heavy with meaning. "But they didn't just underestimate the human's strength. They underestimated something much more dangerous. They underestimated the human's ability to adapt, to think, to outsmart their enemies." Gorn's confusion deepened, and a feeling of unease began to settle in his chest. "Adapt? What do you mean?" Sitka's eyes glinted, almost mischievously. "Humans don't need strength or claws to survive, Gorn. They don't need armor or sharp teeth. What they have is a mind. A mind that can adapt to any situation, any threat, and turn it to their advantage. And that's exactly what they did against the Vraxians." Gorn's tail flicked again, this time more forcefully, a mixture of frustration and curiosity rising in him. But how? The Vraxians were apex predators. They had superior weaponry, superior technology. Sitka smiled, though it wasn't a kind smile. "They had all of that. The humans didn't need any of it. They used what they had, what every species in the galaxy has the ability to develop but few ever truly understand. They used their minds. Their ability to think beyond the obvious. They used tools, machines, and they fought in a way that no one could have predicted. It's not about fighting the way we do, it's about fighting smarter." Gorn was silent for a moment, processing this new information. The idea that a species with no natural defenses, no advanced weaponry, no enhanced physical traits could defeat the mighty Vraxians seemed absurd. And yet, the evidence was there. The Vraxians were gone, their fleets wiped out without a single shot being fired in retaliation. It didn't make sense. But it was real. "What happened to the Vraxians?" Gorn asked, his voice strained with disbelief. Sitka's mandibles clicked once more, and she leaned back in her seat. her eyes glinting with something like admiration for the humans. The Vraxians thought they could simply overpower the humans. They thought they could bomb their cities, crush their defenses with sheer force. But the humans didn't surrender. They didn't flee. They didn't beg. Instead, they fought back with what they had: tools, technology, and most importantly, their ability to think. They used their machines, Gorn. They deployed autonomous drones, tiny machines that exploited the Vraxians' weakness. The Vraxians had no idea what hit them. Gorn's mind was spinning. Autonomous drones? But the Vraxians have shields, advanced technology. How could primitive machines break through that? Because the humans didn't just fight their enemy's strength, Gorn, Sitka explained, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight. They fought their weaknesses. They understood what made the Vraxians tick, how their territorial aggression could be exploited, and they used that knowledge to destroy them. Not with brute force, but with precision, with strategy. For the first time, Gorn understood. It wasn't about matching the Vraxians in strength or weapons. It was about finding a way to use their enemy's own instincts against them. The humans hadn't just fought the Vraxians. They had outsmarted them. The realization hit Gorn like a thunderclap. They didn't fight like predators, he muttered, more to himself than to Sitka. They fought like survivors, problem solvers. Sitka nodded, her eyes flashing with approval. Exactly. They know how to adapt, and that makes them far more dangerous than anything the galaxy has ever seen. Gorn was silent for a long moment. He was still processing the enormity of it all. The Vraxians were not the first powerful species to underestimate humanity, but they were the first to pay the price for it. And now, Gorn was beginning to understand why. Next time, there won't be a next time, Sitka said quietly, almost to herself. Gorn's mind raced, the pieces finally falling into place. The humans weren't just dangerous because of their ability to fight. They were dangerous because they had the ability to think, to adapt, to understand their enemies, not just their strength, but their weaknesses. And once they figured out what made their foes vulnerable, they attacked where it hurt the most. And that was what made humanity the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The true power of humanity wasn't in their physical strength, or their weapons, or their armies. It wasn't in their size or their capacity for violence. No, the real power of humanity lay in their ability to survive through intelligence, adaptability, and an unwavering will to overcome the odds. And for species like the Vraxians, who relied on brute force to conquer and control, the humans had shown them that there was a far more terrifying way to fight. Gorn sat back in his chair, his mind reeling with this newfound understanding. The galaxy would soon realize that humanity wasn't to be underestimated. Not because of what they had in terms of technology or strength, but because of what they had in terms of cunning, strategy, and the most dangerous weapon of all, the ability to think outside the box. And that, Gorn realized, was a force no one could ever truly prepare for. On Earth, the humans weren't begging. They weren't pleading for mercy. They weren't even backing down, not 1 inch. It wasn't what anyone had expected. They didn't crumble under the pressure. They didn't retreat into fear. Instead, they did something far more unexpected, something that no one had prepared for. The humans fought with their minds. While the rest of the galaxy was used to the idea of battles being fought with weapons, firepower, and brute force, the humans chose a different path. They had no massive fleets of warships, no battle-hardened soldiers ready to march to war with their claws and teeth. They didn't need to fight in the same way that every other species did. What the humans possessed, what no one else could have anticipated, was their ability to outthink and outmaneuver their enemies. And it was this unique trait that would change the course of the war. It all began when a human woman appeared on the Vraxian transmission, her face calm and composed, exuding a quiet confidence that sent a shiver down the spines of Zakan's officers. Even as the Vraxian crew fidgeted nervously, uncertain of what was coming, the woman remained still, her presence commanding in its calmness. "Admiral Zakan," she said, her voice smooth, controlled yet unyielding. "Those missiles you see?" Then Zakan's eyes narrowed in disbelief, his cold reptilian gaze locking onto the human on the screen. "What? What are you talking about?" His voice trembled slightly, as if the idea of something so simple, so small, being a threat was unimaginable. The human's expression didn't shift. "They're taser drones," she explained, her eyes as cold as ice. "Autonomous tactical units. Each one carries 1,000 smaller drones. They're designed to slip through the gaps in your shields." Zakan's anger flared immediately. He couldn't understand it. "Impossible," he growled. "Primitive drones won't breach our defenses." The human woman's smile remained unwavering, almost infuriatingly calm. "Just wait. You'll see." What followed next was unlike anything the Vraxian fleet had ever encountered. Zakan and his crew had prepared for missiles, for nuclear warheads, for things they had fought countless times before. But this was something entirely new, something they couldn't fathom. The drones didn't explode. They didn't unleash fiery missiles. Instead, they began to attach themselves to the hulls of the warship. Each drone moved with a terrifying precision, slinking through the gaps in the Vraxian shields. They didn't detonate, they didn't fire. Instead, they latched onto the warships like parasites, a swarm of tiny insects attaching themselves to something far larger. The ships, once mighty symbols of power, now appeared to be nothing more than helpless targets. Gorn, who had been listening to the transmission with growing tension, now sat completely still. His tail froze mid-flick, and his mind struggled to process the scene unfolding before him. What are they doing?" he asked, his voice low, almost fearful. Sitka, watching the transmission intently, murmured under her breath, "Deploying the next phase." The screen flickered to life again, showing thousands of small drones attached to the hulls of the Vraxian ships like deadly, silent insects. Gorn couldn't help but watch, a sickening realization crawling through his body. This wasn't an ordinary attack. These weren't just regular drones. They were something else. They weren't just targeting the ship's weaknesses. They were targeting something far deeper, something primal. Sitka's voice broke through his thoughts, her tone dark and knowing. "They're mimicking the scent of a rival Vraxian pack," she said, a sinister gleam in her eyes. "The moment these drones breach your ships, your crew will respond like predators. They'll go into a blood frenzy. It's your worst nightmare come to life." The words hit Gorn like a punch to the gut. The Vraxians were known for their territorial instincts. It was one of the things that made them so deadly. They would protect their territory with everything they had, often reacting to threats with a bloodlust that was almost impossible to control. But now, the humans were using this against them, manipulating their most primal urges to turn the tide of the battle. Zakan's eyes widened in horror as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice filled with panic. He knew what was coming, and he had no way to stop it. The humans had found their weakness, and now they were exploiting it in the most horrifying way imaginable. Back in the bar, Gorn's mind was racing. He was no longer paying attention to the conversation around him. The story Sitka had shared, the terrifying ingenuity of the humans, had shaken him to his core. But that's not warfare, Gorn muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. "That's something else entirely." The human, who had been listening quietly to their conversation, stood up and walked over to the table. His presence was calm but commanding, like he had all the time in the world to explain. There was a quiet strength to him, a kind of unspoken authority that made Gorn uneasy. This human, just like the others in the galaxy, had no physical strength that matched Gorn's, no combat experience that could rival the fiercest warriors. And yet there was something about him, something in his demeanor, that made Gorn feel small. "That's what humans are, my friend," the human said softly, his voice low and almost soothing. "Not predators. We don't need fangs or claws. We don't even need armor." Gorn looked at him, confused. "Then what makes you so dangerous?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. The human smiled, a smile that felt more like a challenge than a gesture of kindness. "We have our minds," he said, his voice growing a little stronger. "And that's what makes us dangerous. We don't fight like you. We don't fight like the Vraxians or the Hadron or any of the other predators you've met. We fight with our minds. And that makes us the most dangerous species in the galaxy." Gorn's heart skipped a beat. This was something he hadn't anticipated. Humanity didn't need to fight with claws or warships. They didn't rely on strength. They relied on something far more potent. They relied on intelligence, on the ability to outthink and outmaneuver their enemies. And that was something that no one had prepared for. The human's words echoed in Gorn's mind long after the conversation had ended. The Vraxians had been defeated not by raw power, but by ingenuity. They hadn't been overpowered in battle. They had been outwitted, manipulated into a corner, their instincts used against them. The humans hadn't needed to fight the way others did. They hadn't needed to crush their enemies underfoot. Instead, they had exploited a weakness, a psychological trigger that turned the tide in their favor. What made humanity so dangerous wasn't their physical prowess. It wasn't their ability to destroy. It was their ability to think, to strategize, to adapt, to understand their enemies on a level that no one else could. And it was this ability, this power of the mind, that made humanity a force to be reckoned with in the galaxy. The question that had started it all, what happens when you corner a species, had now been answered. And the answer wasn't one of surrender. It wasn't one of flight. It was a response unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Humans didn't run. They didn't beg. They didn't fight with force. They fought with something far more powerful. Their minds. And in that, they had become the most dangerous species the galaxy would ever encounter. Gorn understood, at last. The humans weren't just survivors. They were thinkers, problem solvers. And that, above all else, was what made them so terrifying. As the human continued his tale, Gorn's skepticism waned. The story was unbelievable, yet the implications were clear. Humans weren't just dangerous because they could fight. They were dangerous because they could afford to show mercy. They could have wiped out the Vraxians, the human said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. Instead, they left them alive. To learn. The lesson was clear. The most terrifying species in the galaxy wasn't the one with the sharpest claws or the strongest jaws. It was the one that could choose not to destroy, to hold back when it would have been easy to annihilate. And that, Gorn realized, was humanity's true power, the power of restraint, humanity's most terrifying weapon. So, that's the story, the human concluded, his voice steady and almost casual. But the words carried a weight that pressed down on the entire room. The bar, once filled with the hum of conversation and the occasional clink of glasses, had grown eerily quiet. The air seemed thicker now, charged with an unspoken realization that was slowly taking root in the minds of those listening. The Kazakh traders, their insectoid bodies frozen in place, exchanged uncertain glances. The other aliens in the bar who had been listening in on the tale were similarly silent, their attention rapt on the human. There was a collective shift in the atmosphere, a realization settling like a heavy fog. The story the human had just shared wasn't just about battles or wars. It wasn't about victories or losses. It was about something far more fundamental. Something that no one had expected. The humans didn't just conquer, they adapted. They didn't rely on overwhelming firepower or physical superiority to win their battles. No, they had mastered something far more profound. They understood that the most dangerous weapon wasn't violence. It wasn't claws or fangs or massive warships. The most terrifying weapon in the universe was restraint. The power to hold back, to control, and to choose when and how. And that made the humans more terrifying than anything else in the galaxy. As the human's words echoed through the room, the aliens around him couldn't shake the feeling that they had just witnessed a paradigm shift. Everything they had understood about strength and power, about victory and defeat, had been challenged. The humans didn't need to lash out in rage or destroy everything in their path. They didn't need to prove their superiority through force. Instead, they had used their restraint, an understanding of when not to strike, when to withhold their power, and when to bide their time until the moment of victory was certain. It was this controlled power, this calculated restraint, that had made the humans so successful. While other species had relied on brute force to dominate and conquer, the humans had chosen a different path. They had learned that true power wasn't in the act of destruction. It was in knowing when not to destroy, in understanding that the greatest strength lay not in overwhelming their enemies, but in making their enemies realize that the humans could annihilate them at any moment, and still chose not to. And that realization was what made the human so dangerous. As the human finished his tale, he leaned back, his eyes scanning the room one last time. There was no boasting, no gloating, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew they had already won. The aliens in the bar were left in stunned silence, their minds working overtime to process what they had just heard. Not all predators attack, the human said with a wink, his smile playful yet tinged with something darker, something more unsettling. It was a smile that spoke of power, of control, and of the knowledge that he could unleash chaos at will, and still choose not to. And then, without another word, the human turned and walked out of the bar, leaving the stunned aliens behind. The door swung shut behind him with a soft thud, but his presence lingered long after he had gone. The Kazakh traders and the other aliens sat frozen, their thoughts racing as they absorbed the depth of what they had just been told. The human hadn't just told a story, he had revealed a truth that would change the way these species viewed power, strength, and victory forever. In a universe where might often made right, the humans had shown that the greatest might lay not in violence, but in the restraint to wield it only when necessary. And that, the aliens realized, was the most terrifying thing of all.